Welcome everybody. We've been having a great 5 minutes just before you've all entered the chat room here, ironing out the glitches. So we're all pumped up with adrenaline here. We're very happy to be running this webinar. It's in response to, I'll just start sharing my screen and showing my PowerPoint. I'm Chris Johnson. I'm a member of the Education, Public Engagement and Policy Committee for the Physiological Society. And that committee has been trying to respond to the needs of the members of the society in the pandemic, to best serve them, to help them in their work, which obviously is problematic as we enter the new term. So this seminar is in response to a questionnaire that was put out to the FISSOC members, basically to say or to ask how the Physiological Society could help. And one of the strongest concerns was with running practicals, practical labs, either face-to-face or online in various guises. What we thought was a good idea, something that would be helpful, would be to run a seminar on the kind of things that people are doing, to hear about a couple of examples, 3 examples that some of our colleagues are doing, and to capture that and various other resources that maybe you can provide, and then make them all available at the end via links and web page for you to be able to tap into to help you with your teaching of practicals and delivery of the practical parts of your course. What we're going to do is very shortly, we're going to hear from our 3 panelists from 3 different institutions, just talking about the kind of stuff that they are doing. Now, there'll be some commonality to these 3 panelists, I'm sure, but you take what you find useful from them. We will have the opportunity to question those panelists very briefly, but then there's going to be a more general discussion focused around some key questions that I'll put up in just a second. I'll try my best to bring that discussion together, and then finally a summary. And as I say, whatever is discussed here is being recorded and minuted, so we can provide transcripts and recordings of the session and any links that may arise. So we're going to have Sarah Hall speaking first on a template for successful practical delivery. Derek Scott is going to talk about the logistics of delivery face-to-face. And Mary McGahon is going to talk about online delivery, either synchronous or asynchronous. They're going to talk for about 5 minutes. We're then going to split all our participants into 2 groups. And those 2 groups are going to focus on 2 questions each. So the first question in the first group is, what practicals are you running in the lab face-to-face, and what resilience planning are you doing? The second group, what practicals are you running synchronously and asynchronously? And if we can get some feedback from those groups, and the FISSOC staff are very kindly going to do all the stuff in the background to split people up so you don't have to do anything other than participate if possible. And then we'll be getting a feedback session on the discussions from those groups, and then just a very quick summary at the end. So that is the plan. That was going to be my final slide, but just to reassure you that the session is being recorded, and that any links that we have or that you can post in, then we'll put them up as a resource that you can use at a later date. So without further ado, I think I'll now hand over to my colleagues, Sarah, I think, is going to start off the first presentation.
Thanks, Chris. I've had some technical difficulties, so Chrissy is very kindly posting my slides. Hopefully we'll be able to get them as full screen. I'm talking from the perspective of Cardiff University and the School of Biosciences, but I think that we're probably all in exactly the same position of looking at our practical provision and deciding not only what we can deliver this year, but also what we should deliver this year and how it fits in with all of the other online and on-campus activities that we're doing. So I've been working with a team of academic staff across the spectrum of the degrees and the practical activities that we do. And more importantly, that team also includes our technical staff who really support all of our practical classes. And we have worked together to come up with a checklist really against which we could assess all of our existing practicals and decide which ones we were able to deliver on campus as face-to-face practicals. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Chrissy. And so I just thought I'd share this checklist with you. So after much discussion, I mean, some of this may be familiar to you, or you may have already been through this process yourself, but I thought I'll just share where we are in Cardiff. Clearly, our highest priority is that the practicals should supplement or complement the other teaching and learning activities that we're doing. So there has to be added value. They need to illustrate important core concepts or provide experience of key techniques or allow the students to develop analytical or technical skills. So, those are the priorities. Having established that, we want to make sure that our practicals are as safe as possible. And we always try that. Obviously, that's the aim. But now more than ever, we want to avoid any kind of need for first aid or to deliver first aid. Another important consideration around just turnaround in the classrooms and being able to get students in and out is that any equipment that we use shouldn't require any extensive cleaning and or be very difficult to clean, which then puts it into quarantine. So for example, we found that microscopes, it's really very difficult to clean microscopes adequately. And maybe we can talk about this later, but our solution to that has been to put them into 72-hour quarantine, which obviously has implications for timetabling. With social distancing, it's important now that students are able to complete the practicals individually, working alone, and they shouldn't have to interact too much with anyone else in the lab. We have also put some constraints on the timing of the practicals, so we reduce the amount of time that the students will actually be present in the lab, and again, that's because of the cleaning constraints. Obviously, every single practical has to have some sort of online alternative. So simply refining our on-campus face-to-face delivery means that that's not enough. We have to also have a parallel online alternative so that any students who aren't able to attend the session, they may be shielding, perhaps a member of staff may be ill, or even, God forbid, we have a second wave and we all shut down. We need to have some online provision. So that may include video recording of all of the practical classes, which is something that we're working through now and slowly picking away at. And finally, we want to make sure that there's no assessment that's linked directly to any of the practical activities. So no assessment of the activities in class per se, in order, again, not to disadvantage anybody who can't attend the on-campus face-to-face sessions. So it may be that we provide experimental data sets that the students can then use to analyze, but so there can be associated practicals, but just not directly linked. So this was our checklist. So Chris, if you could go to the next slide, please, that would be good. So when we looked at our sort of the physiology practicals, then really our kind of what you might call in vitro pracs were okay. The things like the enzyme assays, the urine analysis, we could work around these constraints, and we can think of, I think we'll be able to deliver those practicals. Where we got some red flags were really when we looked at physiological measurements, so where the students were making measurements on themselves or on each other. And you can see the crosses there. The problems were around equipment. Clearly something like a spirometer is going to be very difficult to clean, and I think we've come to the conclusion that we won't be able to do spirometry anyway because of the breathing out into the lab. But we have 25 ADI kits. at Cardiff, so that kind of limits how we can get students through. So we had to think about how we clean those and whether we have to quarantine those. And then another red flag was around the students working individually. I mean, working together is something that we kind of actively encourage in physiology. You know, we want the students to place electrodes on one another. We want them to look at each other's measurements as they're being performed and interact with the subject and think about, you know, working together. And obviously that is something that will involve a complete redesign, and we have had to redesign some of our pracs. So as I said before, our in vitro pracs are okay, the ones that involve more biochemical, molecular, biological kind of techniques, but it was the human physiological measurements where we've had to really come up with new approaches. So my next slide just shows you the kind of template for success that we've produced. So this will be used for our ECG practicals, blood pressure practicals, muscle contraction. I've said already, I think we're not going to go down the road of spirometry, and we can't really do VO2 max exercise testing. But what we can do successfully is clearly, to be able to do this, we have to reduce the number of students that are in the lab, and we have to have the students working individually. So with those constraints, actually, we've still got the same number of staff that are going to be present in the lab. So we're going to have much improved staff-student ratios, and there could be real benefits to that. You know, there could be much better, much richer student engagement between students and staff. Every student is going to have to focus on what's happening in the practical. You know, there'll be no room for passengers. They'll be making their own measurements on themselves. The downside, of course, is that they lose that group interaction or that team interaction. So we're going to lose some of the peer-to-peer learning opportunities, and perhaps lose some of the employability attributes associated around group working. I've put there, we've gone to using disposable equipment wherever possible. Our technicians have worked really hard over the last few years to reduce the waste footprint that's associated with our practicals. But I think that's probably just going to go out of the window this year. And so wherever possible, we're just using and throwing away. I've put here that, well, actually, we're also going to try and conflate practicals as much as possible, so that when the students are in the lab, you know, they're able to do more than one thing while they're there. And so to help with that, we've produced a sort of data collection, a kit to allow students to collect their own data at home. So within these kits that we're going to issue to students, we'll have a finger pulse oximeter, so they can record their heart rate and their oxygen saturation. We'll have a peak flow meter, so they can make those kinds of measurements. We're looking into hopefully being able to include a blood pressure monitor. And so that will allow the student, you know, we can set them tasks, and we can design experiments where they make these measurements at different times of day or under different conditions, and then bring those data into the practical classes to supplement, for example, recording of ECG or measuring of blood pressure. We'll also do things like have the students do the Harvard step test at home rather than doing it in the lab. And again, they'll bring their data in. So they will be doing active practical activities, but not necessarily in the practical lab. And of course, we will have much more wraparound provision. So much more extensive preparations online and then follow up afterwards, in addition to any kind of online supplementary or substitute for the practical class. And Chrissy, if you could just hit advanced, I think there's a little bit more that goes on this slide. Yeah. We also need to think much more broadly. We need to take a sort of holistic view of all of the practical activities that the students are doing and try and avoid any duplication of techniques. So even if the subject or the application is different, obviously we're going to have a reduced practical diet and practical provision. So we need to make sure that every single practical is offering something different to build the students' technical repertoire and their practical repertoire. And of course, all of this involves smart timetabling, and you know, timetabling that needs to take into account all of these additional constraints. And I think that Derek is probably going to talk a little bit more about that. And I'm not sure, I didn't keep track of the time. Hopefully I haven't gone on too long, but I just wanted to finish with my favorite quote that is attributed to Darwin, but not necessarily spoken by him. But you know, as physiologists, all we're interested in is maintaining homeostasis. So we need to adapt and carry on. That's what we will do this year. Okay, thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Sarah. Now, I'm not sure, are we going to take questions at this point or after our panelists, all three have finished?
Maybe wait for all three. And
Okay,
any
fair
overlap.
enough. Okay, so thanks very much. So the next up, we have Derek, who's going to talk about logistics of delivery.
Thanks very much. As Sarah said, this is really a team effort we're all involved in. I know that not everyone, there's a lot of people here from different institutions. Not everyone has teaching technicians. I know my institution, we're very lucky to have them. But as Sarah mentioned, I think what we're going through just now is something which is really a group effort. I've been speaking to people from different kind of institutions over the past few weeks. And what it's clear is that a lot of people feel as if they've got the burden of solving everything on themselves. And I think we need to reiterate to people, it's a group effort. We as a society are here to help one another, but also you yourself are not expected to solve every single problem on your own. And I think particularly the students will appreciate the fact that if they see that you're trying your best, you make mistakes, not everything's perfect, they will understand. But I think a lot of us are putting ourselves under a lot of pressure to get things right, particularly if we are trying to run face-to-face practicals and do all the other stuff that we're having to do in order to cope during these strange times. So I think one of the things that Sarah touched on in her kind of discussion was that for a lot of us, it's not the disciplinary material that is really the issue. It's actually the planning and how we work out for every eventuality, how we're going to cope. If I think about my own situation, so I've been tasked in my own institution about sorting out all practical experiences across our entire school. Now that involves clinical activities, it involves nutritional activities, all sorts of things, people who don't necessarily work in a lab. So one of the things we've seen is that particularly for us who do wet science, in inverted commas, we share our labs and spaces with other disciplines or departments or schools. So in particular, our main teaching labs are shared with biological sciences. So one of the things we've started to do is actually, we've always worked closely with them, but actually we've forged a closer relationship during these times because it's the only way that both our schools are going to cope. And particularly in relation to timetabling, that's been really important because for us, we're having to plan for 2-metre physical distancing within our labs. That has really meant a reduction in capacities. I know that lots of you are having to do this planning. I bet when you saw the capacities that were estimated for your spaces, some of you had to go and have a lie down. We have been tasked by our central university in terms of doing what Sarah talked about, reducing our time slots. So if you ran a 3-hour practical, could it be done in 2 hours? If you had an all-day practical, could it be compressed down into something like 2 3-hour sessions? But also during that kind of planning, we've had to think about how do you build in time for cleaning, not just in terms of the lab environment, but also in terms of the equipment, as Sarah said, because there's some things you are going to have to maybe reuse. Not everyone has the amount of equipment they need to actually put some in quarantine. So one of the things we started to do is, again, is focus on practicals where we can actually minimize cleaning, as Sarah talked about, but we're also having to think about, with the technicians, what would be the most efficient way to schedule and run practicals. We've thrown the old timetable out the window in a lot of ways. A lot of the time we're going with the technicians going, what takes you the longest time? How do you think you'll cope? What is the staffing like for the technical staff? Because that will be important to consider as well. Another thing that came out during our kind of discussions were, are we going to have to stagger how the students arrive? If we've got multiple classes all starting on the hour, we could have queues of students. Not all of our labs in my institution have multiple entry points, so we can't necessarily have a one-way system for entry and exit. And we're also going to have to think about whether or not we use things like hand washing or hand gelling when students arrive, factoring the time for them to take off their kind of bags and coats, these types of things. So we're really considering looking at the timetable and staggering classes by 5, 10, 15 minutes to make sure that kind of classes within the same teaching facility don't start simultaneously, again, to minimize traffic. One other thing we've been thinking about is palliative experience. Now, we have students who have told us they can't physically come back for different reasons, whether or not their country's forbidden it for a while, or it's because their family are having financial issues, or they have a long-term health issue. We want to avoid our students feeling that if you can't be present physically, then you're in a kind of lower tier of student. And that's something we've been getting queries about already. If I don't turn up, does that mean I'm not as good? So again, we're having to think about that. People are being encouraged to make it clear that when you do any online synchronous or asynchronous activities to back up what you're doing face-to-face, make it clear that they are all one cohort and they aren't two separate cohorts, because it'd be very easy for that type of attitude to sneak in. But our recent work has really been related to some of the stuff we've seen since our teaching technicians have come back from furlough. Some of our teaching technicians have disabilities, and we've realised that actually using masks is really a problem for people who have hearing impairment. We have some technicians who kind of maybe rely on the elevators. There are limits on who can use the elevators. What if you have multiple students with disabilities coming at the same time to a facility? So we're really having to think about, kind of trying to work out how we can maximise our use of technology or other alternative approaches so that people with disabilities don't feel at a disadvantage just in terms of getting to the practical, let alone taking part in it. And as Sarah mentioned, lots of us are having to maybe quarantine equipment if it's going to be used by students for a long period of time. If you don't have equipment to quarantine, you may have to do extensive cleaning. Have you factored in the time for that? Do you have enough equipment to work individually? We're having to evacuate another lab in another campus and bring all the equipment to one central location to make sure that we can actually staff and equip our practicals suitably. But as everyone kind of might know, lots of us are still reliant on IT during our face-to-face practicals. And one other thing is we're starting to plan what happens if the IT doesn't work? What happens if your microphone doesn't work and you're in a big room? We can't just take our masks off and shout anymore. We're having to think about these issues. I know one thing that some of my colleagues have been trialing is using things like Microsoft Teams while speaking in the lab in order to get real-time subtitling. These are all things we're having to think about now, particularly because of what our kind of technicians have said during their kind of initial time back. And kind of briefly, I just want to touch on some other things that's come out of our planning. Our ability to join forces and share resources with other science and healthcare disciplines within the university has actually allowed us to do far more. We're getting videos of patients from clinical skills, people we never used to have much to do with in the past. They're getting kind of material from us. They're starting to share our LT platform, which a lot of people will be using. We're having to think more carefully about how we deploy our demonstrators. Because we have few students in our classes, we may not need as many demonstrators in the room, but they may have to staff another room if we're having to run multiple rooms simultaneously, or they may have to get more involved in things like online tutorials, which is another thing we're having to do, and we simply won't have enough academic staff. So the way in which we deploy our academics, our postdocs, our demonstrators and our technical staff, we're having to think about carefully. And particularly in relation to, will we have capacity if staff are absent? Or, given that I'm in Aberdeen, one of the few lockdown places in the UK, what happens if you have another unexpected lockdown? That is something my university is really twitchy about now, particularly because of the kind of recent events up in Aberdeen. Where do you keep your model answers? Who will mark things if you're not there? Can someone else run a practical? It has been amazing the amount of material which is only stored in people's head. And that's a kind of habit we're going to have to break within my own institution. And finally, things like PPE. We know that our students are told about kind of making sure they can maintain hygiene within labs, usually making sure they observe safety practices, but other questions have started to come out when we started thinking about things like lab coats, and should we recommend different hygiene practices for our students. One of our technical staff said, well, what about safety glasses? We won't have the time to clean all the sets we give out to students. So we're probably going to have to get our students to buy their own set of safety glasses, and we're going to have to tell them soon because it's an added cost they're going to have to take into account before they attend university. And my final point in relation to logistics and health and safety is that lots of us are going to have to do a lot of things. How are we going to stop ourselves becoming overloaded, too stressed? Lots of people are doing amazing things, giving lots of resources to their students online. One thing we've seen from our medical class since they've started back earlier than other students is that there is a tendency for staff to overload students, put all this wondrous material online or face-to-face in an attempt to compensate in some regard for the effects of COVID over the past few months. And it's actually turning out to be a bit too much for some students and some staff. One thing I think we all need to be aware of is that we avoid overloading ourselves and making sure that we can continue to provide the best education we can for the rest of the academic year. Okay, I think Mary is next up to speak.
That's great. Thanks very much, Derek. Mary, are you
Yep,
good to go?
hopefully you can see my slides now.
Yep.
Yep, okay. So in terms of how we are thinking about delivering our practicals in Queen's, we've had some of the similar discussions. This is not moving on. See, we've started to think about face-to-face delivery versus virtual delivery, and we have looked at rearranging our timetables, and now we're at the stage where we're trying to think about the mode of delivery and how we would support the students. That idea of not overloading them, but giving them the best learning experience that is possible in the current situation. Some things that happens whenever you move online is there's often a loss of that community, a loss of that social interaction that we get in practical classes when students work directly with each other. So trying to replicate that online is a huge task, and it's not always possible for us to be able to do that. So in terms of online practical class delivery, we're thinking in terms of things like synchronous delivery and asynchronous. For the synchronous, it's a live supported event that would hopefully build a community where the students are able to work with each other and able to interact with the staff in a much more flexible environment. But the asynchronous gives the student a chance to do the practical at their own pace. So we've all got other commitments within our life in this current environment, and having an activity which is solely based on an online platform means that they can do it whenever they're free. It also means for us that that's probably much more easy to deliver rather than a live event. We don't know whether we're going to be locked down. We don't know what our ability is to access materials and access the internet. So in terms of an asynchronous approach, if we're thinking about the platform, we're thinking about having all of the materials for that class available on one platform. And we're possibly backing that up with a discussion board so that that has a backup for the students so that they can answer their questions if they've got any. In order to protect our own academics' peace of mind, you would want to set hours on those discussion boards so that you're not monitoring those on a regular basis. You've got to set hours that you're going to monitor those for, so that the students know when they can ask questions and get feedback if they need that, but that you're not getting peppered with 1,000 questions, the same question over and over again. The disadvantages possibly of an asynchronous sort of delivery is that you may not get that sense of community, and you don't always know whether the students have engaged with the material and are actually getting something out of it. But we have to make the best of what's possible at the moment. So this is a mock-up of what we're kind of delivering in an asynchronous format. We're using the LT platform. We have a series of videos showing the activity. This is the hemoglobin practical. We give the students the data and they then work out the hemoglobin concentration and they answer a series of questions as they go along. With this asynchronous activity, we've actually enabled the check answer format here so that the students can see and get instantly feedback on whether they've been thinking correctly or making a calculation correctly. So that's probably a good idea for that asynchronous activities. In terms of the synchronous activities, now these would be a more scheduled activity. We would have maybe a live talk on Teams or on Zoom, and we'd then go into a series of breakout rooms. These breakout rooms will be supported by the demonstrators and would allow the students to then interact with each other and interact with the demonstrators in a more live activity environment. And we'd finish up the practical with a summary where we get everybody back together and discuss the outcomes and what's happened and how it's basically gone for them. So this would be what we would be talking about in terms of teams. We would have our practical class team, we'd have our delivery of our pre-practical talk, and we'd have our series of breakout rooms, and there'd be interaction with the academic who'd be leading the activity. So the students are very much getting a more face-to-face feel without the actual face-to-face contact. And one of the mock-ups we have for this, again on LT, is where we have our data being supplied by our demonstrators every 15 minutes or so. There's a series of questions that the students would discuss within their group, within their breakout room. We're not giving any hints to answers in this setup. It's very much the students are talking to each other and coming up with those answers together. So it's much more of a team effort. So that really does give us the advantage of building that community and developing those social interactions that we would have in a face-to-face environment that we're very much losing when we move to online. But there are disadvantages. There's always going to be disadvantages of any synchronous class, and that very much lies within the internet capacity of our students, whether they're actually in the same time zone as us. You know, we have students from Canada or students from Malaysia, and they may not be able to enter that online environment at the time point at which we want them to be there. So we always have to have that asynchronous backup. The other thing that the synchronous classes depend on is the demonstrators and your team. And that means that everybody has to be on the same idea, the same wavelength, the same level of training for the demonstrators. And that takes a lot of effort to get a number of demonstrators and to get their capabilities, both internet-wise and technically wise, up to scratch. So the final thing I'm going to just consider is maybe what is the best options. Face-to-face will be wonderful, but as Derek has said, you can't always fit enough people into the rooms. There's lots of drawbacks. You have to be thinking about the safety ideas and exposure for the students and for the staff. So if you move then to the synchronous, you're thinking about those internet capacities and being able to have students interact with each other. That's not always possible with their technologies. Whereas the asynchronous is probably the easiest to run. It may not be the best learning experience for the students, but certainly they can take it at their own pace. They can decide when they carry out that practical class and when it fits in with their own lives. We have a saying in Queen's that comes from a very old professor, that it's the art of the possible. So it very much is what is possible for us to be able to deliver in the current climate, and some things are not always possible. We just have to live with some little problems. So that's me.
Okay, Mary, thanks very much. I'm just trying to see if I'm not muted. I'm on video, and there's an awful lot of information being disseminated there, and I think that people will be looking back on this and replaying bits to get the full impact of what's been said. Rather than going to or allowing questions to the individual panelists at this stage, I think that given that we are running over, we'll go to our breakout discussions now. Can I ask that our panelists will, if they're prepared to hang on afterwards, to pick up any questions that our participants may have that aren't covered by the rest of the discussion groups, then maybe that's the way to go.
The physiology practicals for the medics, vets and natural scientists at Cambridge. The current plan that we have at the moment is that we've made all of the classes online, and we're front loading as many as possible into the first term to free up some space in the second term. And then the idea is that in the second term, we have some live sessions, which we hope will be a little bit easier then. And we use the live sessions not to introduce new material, but to give the students an opportunity to use the equipment that they've looked at in the online ones earlier. So for example, they've been through the theory of the electrocardiogram, let's say in the first term. They've looked at some ECG traces, they've done some interpretations, answered some questions. Then in the second term, they come in and then they stick it all on themselves and they try to get their own ECG. And we do the same thing for things like blood pressure, sphygmomanometry, pulse oximetry, and so on and so forth. If they can't make the live session, they've seen all of the material in the online format. So that's where we're heading at the moment.
So in your live sessions that you're planning, though, presumably you're still having to be COVID safe for those live sessions.
Yeah, so we're trying to make sure that the students are distanced around the room. They're all things that they can do individually, so they can put on the electrodes themselves. And then we're going to have to think about sterilisation and so on, of course.
I think Rachel Ashworth has her hand up as well, if she would like to join in the discussion.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Rachel. I'm from Queen Mary, and I teach on the medical course. So a lot of what I heard from the speakers kind of plays out with what we're doing at the moment. We've got, I think, partly on the medical course, we have an issue with numbers. So it's going to be even worse this year, obviously. So that's a bit prohibitive for face-to-face. So we're starting online because it's just logistically quite tricky if we have almost 400 first years to get them through any kind of meaningful labs at the moment. But we are planning face-to-face with our graduate entry because that's more manageable in terms of numbers, and we feel like we can do the social distancing. We're very conscious, like I think Derek alluded to this, about some students not being able to return to campus and actually be present. So anything we're doing in the lab is being called enrichment activities at the moment, and it's not something that's going to be necessarily examinable, just to sort of alleviate the unfairness of people not being able to come. So that's how we're starting, and we're going to use that to kind of plan our one-way system and try and make it safe and all the rest of it. And we're teaming up with anatomy, actually. So we're doing integrative physiology and anatomy, which is really fun to think about how those things fit together. So it's something a bit new.
We're doing that at Cardiff as well. Yeah, it's
I mean, are you able to, I mean, I don't know about anyone else, one thing that in discussion with anatomy, at first they thought they wouldn't be able to do any dissection this year because, again, they tend to cluster around kind of cadavers and specimens and things. But what they are trying to do now is that smaller groups who do anatomy, they're trying to give them some practical experience if they can. But it's the big cohorts like medicine and things that they're really struggling with. I mean, I liked your idea there that you're trying wherever possible, if you've got a smaller cohort, to do what you can, because again, it could kind of allow you to try things in a kind of easier environment. I don't know if anyone else has got a comment. Yeah.
So we're using pro sections for the anatomy at the moment. There'll be no dissection, but at least you can do kind of station based and just have one student at each station. Yeah.
I mean, I know that lots of people, particularly kind of, have alluded to the fact that it's the human work that seems to be the issue. And that's kind of one thing we've been concerned about. I see Declan has his hand up. Joe, if you'd like to contribute to the conversation.
Frank, I see you next.
You can hear me. I hope everyone's keeping well. I must confess, I am an anatomist. While I trained as a physiologist, I have now turned to the dark side. Although I say the opposite when I'm in my NASOC meetings as well. I work in Queen's in Belfast alongside Chris and Mary. And just like some of our other contributors there were saying, in terms of medical teaching, the Centre for Medical Education has decided that their new first years actually aren't going to be doing any dissection at all for the whole year. And because of that, then we've started to implement some of our sort of pre-recorded videos that we'd already made in terms of using our own pro sections and helping the students to teach that way. I've also made some videos with Mary and Chris and Sean for some of our physiology practicals as well. Basic things like how to use pipettes, capillary tubes for running hematocrit exercises, transfer factor, all that kind of thing. Coming back to the anatomy, we're also using pro sections, but we, I guess, have the luxury of, we've got cameras suspended in our ceiling, so we're allowed to broadcast underneath or record underneath and broadcast out to 18 touchscreens within the room. And our room normally can hold about 130. One of the things we're finding is because of the social distancing requirements, it's such a shame that these huge big lab spaces, you know, they're some of the biggest rooms that we have access to, are actually not being able to be used to their full capacity. However, that said, it does allow us to get a heck of a lot more students into a room than it would be if it was a smaller lecture theatre. So our plan is to face-to-face as much as we can, but we have a backup of everything in video, and especially with anatomy, we've purchased some online Ackland's video catalogue, so we're making use of those as well. But I think it's going to be difficult, and it's horses for courses. It'll not, one size won't fit everyone, but we're making a lot of use of video.
Thanks, Declan. Frank Howarth, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, my name is Chris Howarth, and I'm from the Department of Physiology in the College of Medicine and Health Sciences, UAE University. We run a 6-year medical curriculum, and this year, luckily, I managed to complete all my practical classes before COVID kicked in. But in the coming semester, of course, I'll be facing this challenge along with colleagues. And what I was wondering is if I could come up with a possible process that people could criticize and comment on for a particular practical. So I'd like to talk about a first-year practical. We call it red blood cell fragility. I'm sure people are familiar with that practical in some form or another. And what we were proposing to do is to do it online, live. I mean, that's fraught with technical difficulties, but this was our idea, that we would give to the students an introduction. This would be on Blackboard, by the way, probably. Ultra Collaborate Blackboard. And the idea was that we would give the students an introduction. The technician would then perform the practical, let's say dividing it into 3 different steps. So they would deliver step 1 of the practical, you would have some commentary about it. They would deliver step 2 of the practical, there'd be some commentary, and then perhaps step 3 and some commentary. And then at the end of all this, we would have some discussion, question time. And then what we would do is we would go over an assessment, and we would circulate to all the students an assessment, which they could then complete in the coming days and then send it back to you. The assessment typically involves some calculations, some analysis, some graph drawing, and some questions. And we would record all this, so for students, for some reason or other, couldn't attend the session, we would then be able to, they'd be able to go to the recording of the whole thing and see it, if you like, offline. And I'm just wondering what people think about that approach. Do you think that would work? There's obviously some technical limitations to that, but we feel that this is at least one approach that we might consider. Thank you.
Duncan, did you want to answer that?
Yeah, we've been doing this for quite some time. I'm Duncan Banks. I've been involved in physiology teaching in a variety of traditional and non-traditional universities. I work for the Open University. Unfortunately, I've had years of envy about physiology practicals, but with up to 4,000 students, it's absolutely impossible to do it. So all of what you say, we've already got as online experiences with precisely what you're saying, someone doing the experiment. It can be recorded, it doesn't need to be live, although some of the richer experiences are where the students themselves decide what to do with a sample. And that's quite interesting. They work in groups and decide what to do with the samples. But we've been hearing about spirometry and so on, ECG. These are all possible online. And in fact, the advantage you lot have is I'll give you access to all this free of charge. So you can access at the moment Open Science Laboratory, which is part of the public engagement for the Open University to help people understand practical-based subjects. And I'll provide, I don't know who's running the show today, but Charlotte, I think we've met before, haven't we? I'll provide you with the URL with some links that you can perhaps look at and see whether or not they're appropriate. What we usually do with those sort of things is to adapt them for our own use.
Sorry, one thing I did forget to mention was that our cohort is typically somewhere between 100 and 150 students. So that's our intake. So we're not dealing with the number of students that you're talking about in the Open University.
Yeah, that's fine. But, you know, with medical students of up to almost 400 in some places, that is a problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. That would be really helpful, Duncan. And I think that Sarah Bundup will be able to take the details from you, and then we can share them more widely. Yeah. So we'll do that offline after.
Yeah, do it offline. Yeah.
Thank you. That would be really helpful. Because of course the Open University are streets ahead of the rest of us on this kind of delivery. So
I mean, I can also demonstrate how we produce our modules and how we integrate these activities within stuff, and how the activities are assessed and so on, things like that. You may or may not be aware of how we do stuff.
Could I say something else? Another approach that we've been using in the past, and perhaps we'll build on, is to use computer-based learning. So, for example, you can do a pharmacology experiment in gut where you try various concentrations of drugs and see what effect it has on, various physiological parameters. And students potentially, I guess, could do that from wherever they are. But the problem we've been facing is finding useful resources, finding software that would meet our requirements. And that we found a challenge. And I don't know whether anybody who's listening to this has access to software that might be useful, for the physiological community at large. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Alice has her hand up, yeah.
Yeah, we've been looking at software for like that Trinity College Dublin. There's the Sheffield Biosciences have some, it's not too expensive. I'm not sure that we've been looking at, and I think the American Physiological Society also have a resource where a lot of links to, I haven't checked through them, they're kind of resources that the smaller universities in America have put together over the years, and that looks quite good. I haven't had time to go through them, but the Sheffield Biosciences is good, and I've looked into at St Andrews University. They have some good NeuroSim, which is quite good for neurophysiological type experiments, and also for group projects as well, by the looks of it, that you can develop them for final year physiology students as well as thinking about med students.
Oh, thank you. Actually, thank you very much. And that's a good point, in that we are hosting another one of these kind of town hall sessions around final year projects on the 11th of September. So I think there's still space on that if people wanted to join that. And that will be focused specifically on final year project provision. I think information is on the website. Is that right, Chrissy?
Yeah. Sarah, you have 1 minute left.
But a few examples of simulations that you can use, and also access to the Open Science Laboratory in the chat. On the main session, we didn't have access to that, but I've just done it now if you want to.
Thank you.
There's someone who's listed as NMS70 who's got their hand up. Sorry, I can't see your name.
Sorry, it's Michelle Sweeney, Newcastle University. I don't know why Zoom's not logging me in properly. But anyway, I just wanted to say on the same topic, Dave Lewis has the eBiopracticals spreadsheet thing that he shared at different things. So it has links to simulation programs and some practical resources, so some of the ones you've mentioned already. But I think that's freely available. He shared it at a variety of different forums before.
That's great, thank you very much. I guess one thing we probably want to say is that we're aware that for a lot of people, the idea of resilience is something we probably haven't covered so much, but I guess it's probably foremost in lots of our minds. We're probably not going to take too many more questions, because I know that we've been told we've got 1 minute left before we return back. But I kind of just want to thank you all for kind of being willing to kind of take part in the discussion. And I want to thank Duncan for the links he's put in the kind of chat, because I think that's really useful for a lot of us. And I suspect the Society might be in touch with you more to kind of maybe speak to you in person about kind of your experience as an online educator. So we've got 30 seconds apparently until we kind of close this breakout room. So we should be rejoining everyone else, and we might suddenly just vanish when we kind of go back for the final sum up. And Zoom is something we're all learning to cope with. I'd never used it before lockdown.
I think hopefully we'll be able to capture all of these resources that are being listed in the chat. Chrissy, if you can maybe at least grab those or save those.
How do we deliver an effective blood pressure practical? We had a suggestion to send the students home with a blood pressure monitor with a SFIG and stethoscope. And then we had the question from above, what happens if the subject collapses? So, how are we all, actually facilitating these activities? So anybody wants to chime in, go for it.
If I can say something.
Sure.
We have one of the practicals that we normally run, which is usually linked to an assessment, which we're not doing there, is exercise and blood pressure. And we monitor blood pressure, we monitor the heart rates, the ventilatory capacities and things like that throughout the Harvard step test and cycloergometry. So this year we're not running that practical. However, what we are doing is there's a little bit of a gamble at the moment between myself and some of the technical staff as to who's going to be the subject. And one of us is going to go in and we're going to get recorded doing that practical to show the students online what we're looking for, how the techniques are performed, how to manipulate the data, how to present the data. So that's what we're doing for the blood pressure, and that's what we're doing for heart rate. But when it comes to things like, if I can just check my notes here, for example, the ECG, we're actually getting them in the lab, but we're only having 12 students per lab session. We're going to have them separated out. And they're going to be putting their electrodes on themselves, but we're also making face masks and face shields mandatory. And by saying it's mandatory, we're actually providing that. We've got our engineering department making face shields that we're going to be providing to every student that comes onto the course. So they can take that face shield home and clean it themselves. Every year, we always provide our students with lab goggles anyway, so it's their responsibility to turn up to every lab normally with face goggles. And if they don't turn up with the goggle, we have the rule that they don't enter the lab. And so this year, if they turn up without the face shield, if they turn up without the face mask, we're going to have some spares that we're going to provide them with. But then, if they continue to do that, they won't be allowed in. It's as simple as that.
Adam, can I ask what would happen then if you've got students who are in lockdown or who are having to socially distance within, they've been infected? Have you got a backup then online for your ECG practicals?
We don't have a backup online for that. The only thing I can think of at the moment, because I'm struggling with that myself, is how to have backup for these practicals. We could film the practical session, but I'd need permission from all of the students involved. Might not get that. The only other thing I can think of is to have some kind of online worksheet that we put onto the VLE for them to work through. And as opposed to lectures this year, what I'm trying to do is to transcribe the lecture material into online learning on the VLE, directing them to various videos, various resources, various recommended reading. And the actual synchronous lectures this year, we're going to have the normal 3-hour slot, but there's going to be the first hour of what have you learned from your studies this week? What have you read up on? What have you achieved? Then the second hour will be an activity. So it might be another worksheet they have to work through or a specific video that they have to watch. And then for the final hour, it's what have you learned from that activity? How does that apply to the learning that you've done in your in this week so far from the VLE? So it's kind of preparing them and expecting them to do the work beforehand, come in, explain what they've learned, And then if they've got any questions, to talk through those questions in real time as much as we can get a live lecture as possible. So that's how I'm planning on attacking it. But I do recognise there is still flaws and holes in it.
Has anybody else any comments?
I've raised my hand, but I don't know if anyone can see me.
Can't see hands. Sorry, can't see hands. You just have to shout at us.
I'm shouting then. We've been told that our 65-person practical labs can only hold 8, and we've got 600 Common Year 1 students coming through, so we don't have enough hours in the day to do our practicals. So we're filming everything. We're going to film all of our Common Year 1 practicals, all our sports science practicals, all our MSc practicals, and that's what I'm doing over the next 2 months. And then we're just going to have an online practical demonstration where a member of staff shows that it can be done. And then we're having the real data from LabChart or whatever we use available online for the students then to download and analyze in their usual way. But it's a humongous effort to get it all done.
Could I have a quick question there, Mary? The videoing of a consenting subject, has that been passed by a safety committee people, whatever? Because we're at that stage.
We've spent most of the summer applying for ethical approval to carry out these practicals on our colleagues, and that's taken a while to get that through as well. But we're lucky at King's. About 5 years ago, we set up a kind of a blanket approval for most of our physiology practicals that just involves filling in a form and signing it. So we've been able to set it up fairly quickly. But you're right, it's been a bit of an issue. But that's why we've chosen to do it on members of staff who are going to consent to do it, and we've had to create a form for them to fill in for the videoing and all the rest. So it has been a bit of an uphill struggle.
That's the way to go to get it through the ethics committee, but any committee like that does take time, so that's another problem for people to think about. But I think that is the way of nailing it, basically.
Somebody said earlier about doing practicals at home, and we could well give some of our students equipment. But the ethics committee went absolutely ballistic when we suggested that a student could perhaps hold their breath and put their head in a bucket of water and measure their heart rate. So we gave up on that.
Oh, that's a shame.
Sorry.
Go ahead,
John.
Sean.
Just to comment on that, Chris and I and James Jameson have a need of an incremental exercise test of exhaustion practical, which I volunteered to be the subject of. You know, I'm doing a lot of exercise during lockdown because there's not much else to do. So I'm reasonably fit, but the problem is that a maximal exercise is an aerosol generator. So I think we're going to have to simulate maximal exercise. That's the problem. So I'm going to pretend to be going hard, and someone's going to have to spray water on me so I look like I'm sweating. And then we'll present data previously gathered from an incremental test on me, of which there is a few. So there are still issues with doing practicals on one another, or performing practicals on one another. That is a problem.
Yeah, we found that since the NHS are currently banning all spirometry testing, we had no hope of doing any of that. So as soon as you put an ethics approval in for that, they just blanket declined it. So we are restricted in what we can do. And you're right, the maximal test, we are doing exactly the same as you, and we're going to fake it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, I was shamefully unaware of the fact that the NHS have banned all spirometry, and it's a very, I mean, it's a completely damning thing for that kind of protocol. So that's worthwhile knowing.
But you can fake that too with a set of bellows. Using an old-fashioned photograph or something like that.
Sure.
I was quite impressed with Sarah Hall. I was going to run my exercise and applied physiology special study module as data only, but interestingly, Sarah Hall is sending people home to do their own Harvard STEP tests, which is it. I may get people to do that, report their own results. That seems to me to be quite a good idea.
Interestingly, for the spirometry, if you're using a vitalograph of any sort, whether it's electronic or otherwise, you can get the mouthpiece filters that can filter out virus particles. So surely that's a mitigating factor.
We tried arguing.
Oh, okay. Brick wall. Yeah.
I can imagine scenarios where between the mouthpiece and the mouth and the nose, there might be some leakage somehow, especially at maximal effort. Yeah, good try.
Yeah, I think that the problem is exercise practicals generally involve a lot of spit and snots, so there definitely is going to be virus particles floating about.
So maybe we should ask, are there any tricks that we're missing here? Is there any particularly well thought out and good practicals that we can do either synchronously or asynchronously online?
I mean, one thing that we're using, or we're looking at using, is you can get these little personalized kind of spirometers that plug into your phone. Mm-hmm. And you breathe essentially into your phone, and then that data is sent automatically to a central computer. And so we can get students to potentially do that at home. If we supply them with one of these, they work out at about €10 each, so about £8 or something.
That sounds really interesting. Would you be prepared to give details about that? If you can submit them to the society, there's going to be links to that we'll upload stuff onto. If you could give just some brief details about that, because I think that is something that people may well be interested in.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem at all. I mean, they're being used routinely here by the Asthma Society to collect data, and they literally just plug into the audio slot on your mobile phone.
Wow.
And you blow into it, and that signal is somehow converted and sent via unicorns and the rest.
Are those devices
I'd love to read your
specific?
Practical protocol.
Are those devices specific for Android phones?
Yeah, you do it on iPhones and on Androids as well.
So it has a lightning cable attachment?
Yes. No, it's like a little handheld device. It just has like the little slot that you see. Now, this is where I get very technical. You know the little thing that you see when you just plug in your earphones into it has
earphone jack. Yeah.
Yeah, the little jack thing, and that just plugs into the phone. It has this like a tiny little spirometer that you just breathe into. And
because modern iPhones don't have that jack.
No, you kind of an adapter for it. I mean, I know some phones work and some don't. So we had the company that produced this. They came to kind of show us how it worked and all this kind of thing. And about at the table there was about maybe 8 of us, and about half of them the phones worked. But I think they have improved that, and they also have they've improved the technology as well, so you're able to do flow volume loops and that kind of thing as well. So
excellent.
Sounds really good.
Yeah, I can send those details on.
That would be great. Thank you. Are there any other good ideas like that we are missing out on? I suspect we're going to get closed before too long. We'll keep going until we are, but are there any other points that people would like to make about synchronous or asynchronous delivery online?
Oh, sorry, Chris, it's Sarah here. I'm going to give the other group a 1-minute warning, just so they have a heads up, okay?
So have we got 1 minute?
Yep, I believe so.
Okay.
Oh, right. Okay. So that's an error we have.
I think the only thing I'm going to say about synchronous and asynchronous is that we're not in the realms of traditional learning anymore.
Exactly.
And so we just need to break it up, and we need to have a greater impetus on independent learning, and then let the students bring what they've learned to live lectures, which really would be live discussions more than anything else.
I mean, I think that what we do in the next next 2 semesters is temporary. Some of it may roll on to be used again if it proves to be a good way of going, and I think that's going to happen quite a bit. But a lot of it is making the best of a bad job. So yeah, I'm with you on that.
One other thing, if this goes on longer, would it be worth the Physiological Society collecting data from all the institutions? When we do practicals, can we have a central data repository so that we could share data between ourselves? And so if somebody has difficulty collecting data or providing a practical, they can obtain data for that practical from a different institution.
I think that's a good idea. I assume PhysSoc have the capability of doing that. But I think we'd have to get back to you. But certainly if you can put that, well, I think it will be minuted and we can act upon it. So we'll get an answer one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I have 20 years worth of data from exercise and applied physiology anthropomorphic tests that I'm very happy to share with anyone who wants, including the sports that people are involved in, the genders, the weights, the whole nine. So I'm really glad I have that, because I will be using that this year.
And there are the likes of ADI, and there are several other commercial packages. Some are free, where you can recreate practicals online. I remember one on action potential and changing contributions of different resting membrane potentials, that kind of thing. There are a whole host of resources that, again, if people have other resources that are, say, online, as well as whatever they can offer themselves, then please put them in, and we'll basically have a big old list that is a resource with links that people can tap into. Okay, guys, so we're now going to try and just bring out some of the strongest points that's come out of that discussion from the two different groups. And we're going to start off with the first group that's looking at the face-to-face teaching and the resilience. Is that you, Derek?
Yeah, can do.
Okay.
I guess in summary, we didn't cover so much the resilience, but I think we found a lot of commonality. Lots of people concerned about particularly numbers. I mean, lots of people found the main constraint they had were in terms of numbers, and particularly because the issues about how do you know how many people you're going to have in your class, with all the issues with qualifications just now, that was raised. Lots of people, again, thinking about seeing face-to-face perhaps as an enrichment activity rather than actually as something that's better than online, because again, people seem very keen to make sure that kind of students who are participating online don't have a second-class experience wherever possible. Lots of kind of people giving examples of how they are kind of learning lessons from other or collaborating with other disciplines, such as anatomy. We had people discussing about streaming video live from certain kind of events, whether that be a technician or a demonstrator or someone doing a practical for the first stage, having a bit of discussion, doing the next stage, a bit of discussion, then having a kind of overall discussion and then an assessment. And what we learned was, again, kind of one of our participants was from the Open University, who had a lot more experience of this style of kind of learning and teaching than the rest of us, and was kind enough to share some links to some activities that they'd previously used. And I think that might be something for the kind of society to consider, is speaking to Duncan, who was part of our session, to get his take about maybe kind of, they've been there and done it before the rest of us. Again, some people were considering about where they could access resources. Lots of people were keen to find out where kind of free or existing or good quality online resources occurred already in order to supplement their face-to-face practicals or allow them to do things face-to-face or to support the students who are doing it. One kind of thing as we saw from that is that people were mentioning some of the links that had gone around, both from people like Dave Lewis, but also which are already posted on the Society's website. But I know that some people are using other resources such as the American Physiological Society's LifeSci TRC resource. So I guess that kind of generally sums up what we were discussing. Lots of people with very similar kind of concerns and experiences.
Okay, Derek. Yeah, I mean, it's crossing over into the kind of discussion that we've been having, perhaps inevitably. But are there any other major points that anyone would like to make at this stage before we go on to the second group?
I mean, I think the only additional point I would make is that, you know, I think we're all pretty comfortable in being able to deliver physiology practicals face to face. it's the constraints around it. You know, the content is not a problem, and so we didn't have very much discussion of that. Most of the discussion was really around supplementing what we can do online.
Okay. Okay, then, so I'll move on to just try and briefly summarize what was said in our group. Mary, you can chip in when you see me going awry, but there are several people are hoping to capture various activities on video and then provide them to the students either as a live stream or asynchronously. One of the interesting points that came up about one of the approaches that was mentioned was to send students away with equipment to do that, to do various kind of things, spirometry being one of them, in the confines of their own home. Now, there are a couple of issues. I didn't know that certainly in terms of attempting spirometry in class, that's not going to go for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is the fact that the NHS have banned all spirometry. So that's a pretty major hurdle for anyone to get over. However, one of our participants was mentioning the facility for a spirometer, a relatively cheap spirometer that can be attached to a phone. That does sound like it is possible to run some form of practical. She even mentioned flow volume loops, so it's getting to a fair degree of sophistication. Basically, people gathering data through their phones. There's been quite a lot of discussion about getting data from various sources and then providing that for the students to work with. And one of the suggestions was that if it's possible for the Physiological Society to host, I don't know what it would be exactly, a page of links or something like that, or files from data previously gathered by our colleagues. Because sure enough, we've got so much data on every facet of human physiology. Anything that's been measured in a practical class can be made available potentially. So if the Physiological Society is able to host this and will make inquiries into this, then a suggestion was that there would be a repository of human data of various types that could help support providing students with data, particularly if there is problems with gathering fresh data with all the constraints that are currently in place. Mary, do you have any other thoughts about what was said, or anyone else would like to?
Sure, there was also a sense that we could share films so that everybody wouldn't be trying to video the same activity. And that might be a repository that could be housed within FISOC. And I think that we had a little discussion where somebody mentioned the ethics approval for actually carrying out the experiments on staff. It's something I haven't actually considered myself. And I wonder if we're sharing data, we need to be very careful possibly as to whether we are allowed to share that data, whether we have approval to share data, and whether it's anonymized in such a way that nobody could be identified from it. So there's certainly things that we probably need to consider from that sharing of documents and sharing of information, that we might initially say, oh yes, absolutely, I'm going to share this, this, and this, but maybe we need to think about that a little bit deeper as well.
Well, ethical approval is a wormhole that we haven't actually gone down. But I think that we need to give it some very strong consideration, and certainly that would be something that would be covered by that, I think. Are there any other?
Could I have one suggestion as well? Would it be possible, I mean, this is obviously something that's very important, so much so that we're having this discussion here now. Yeah. Do you think it would be wise if the FISOC organised a working group specifically for the COVID teaching? because we don't know how long it's going to go on for. And so if we continue a working group on this, so we can identify how we overcome hurdles through this, and keep it going, keep the links going, meet regularly, and then if there's a second wave, if there's a third wave, if there's a different pandemic, we have an automatic response that we can link to.
I mean, that sounds like a great suggestion, and I can put that to the members, I think, probably of the EPP committee. I think it's them that would deal with it in the first instance. And see where it goes from there. I know that there is a committee meeting in September, but I suspect that we could probably circulate that kind of suggestion before that, so that we can be as timely as possible. But I agree, this thing's not going to go away for some time in all likelihood. Yeah. And if we can try and arm ourselves for the foreseeable future, then that would be a good idea.
Yeah, it would help us standardise best practice.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I am just coming to the end of my term as chair of that committee, but I'll still be chair until November. So yeah, I think there's definitely something we can do, and do it soon, so that we're, yeah.
Excellent.
I think there's a quick question there from Frank.
Yeah, well, a question and a suggestion. The question is, just in general, to what extent are people making use of mobile phone applications for physiology practicals? And the second thing is, we're all doing practicals in different ways. I suggested one approach. I wonder whether some of these things could be uploaded onto the Physiological Society website, so that the community at large could make use of these resources. So for example, if somebody does an isolated heart practical in some parts of the world, could that be uploaded onto the physiological website so that others could make use of it? I'm just wondering whether that's a possibility.
It's a definite possibility, and it's something that we've tried to do often. And we do tend to run into difficulties over sort of intellectual property and people being a bit uncertain about sharing their things more widely. But that was in a pre-COVID era. So things may have changed now, but certainly that's something that we're strongly encouraging.
Well, with that in mind, then why not have some kind of, I hesitate to use the word textbook, but some kind of resource where we can, as a society, have a list of practicals that are generic and that any institution can tap into. Whether the education committee can start working on that and putting the feelers out to people in various institutions. We don't have to necessarily have exactly what each institution is doing, but find out what practicals they're doing and come up with something that is possible to run across the board.
Sounds it sounds attractive, but
yeah,
it obviously somebody's got to do it, as it were. Yeah. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, I'm thinking of another possibility to encourage people. The Physiological Society could offer some kind of bursary for this, so it could be put almost on a commercial footing.
Well, we do have funding available to do that. So there is always an open call for funding for people to develop educational resources. So I think maybe that we just need to advertise that more widely, and really, you know, what we're looking for are people who are producing exactly the kind of thing that you're suggesting, something that can be used much more widely and will have a real sort of impact on the community.
Can I just say that the deadline for that, the David Jordan Award, if that's what you're thinking of, is the end of September.
Yeah, yeah.
It's Satine Tansey here from Queen's. Just to say, people who might know, the American Physiological Society have a publication, so it's Advances in Physiology Education, and they have a practical source book section. We've actually contributed to that, and also we've looked at other practical classes in terms of, it tells you all about the apparatus you need. Sorry, that's my washing machine in the background. And it provides you with test questions, etc. I'm going to stop now because it's going to go off. But just for people to know that there is a source book on practicals in Advances in Physiology Education, that journal, for anyone who's interested.
That's a fair point. I've forgotten about that, and we've published many times in it. as I'm sure our members have as well. Okay, how are we doing for time here, Chrissy? Should I try and round things off?
Yeah, we're 15 minutes over, so it might be best to draw it to a close.
Okay, so it looks like we have a whole bunch of things to be doing, as it were, as a committee, but also as members. We're trying to draw together basically a pool of resources. This is the starting point, I think, of that. And I would ask people to contact PhysSoc with the kind of resources that we have been talking about, and we'll figure out the best way of consolidating this so that it can be made available to all our members, and obviously in a timely fashion to be of use for the coming semester, but also maybe thinking a little bit longer term as well. And it sounds like the thought of a working committee to try and further these resources is a good idea, and will be taken further. So I think that that's about all I need to say, really, except to thank, first of all, the Physiological Society for hosting this, and the people who have been sorting this out in the background and making sure that we're able to pull this together, because I hate to say it, that I'm still a novice on these online presentations. So the likes of Chrissy and to the Sarah from PhysSoc have been great in helping us out, and our panelists for putting together something that is truly meaningful, I think, in terms of helping people direct their teaching activities for practicals. Some of the ideas will be new, some of them will just reassure people in what they're doing already. But I think we're all feeling this sense of trying to make the best of a bad situation. And it's reassuring to see that people are genuinely keen on giving the students the best experience that they can under the circumstances. So I think just to finalize then, we will have the recording of this session available. I think that we're going to produce some written version of notes taken throughout the discussion. And also we're going to try and pull together the resources that we have here and that you will contribute in the near future. And those will be made available. We'll send relevant links when we can out to the participants, and there will be a resource or more on that link there as a PhysSoc web page.